Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's instalment of the Australian Water Reform Roadshow. My name is Mark Dougal. I am the founder and managing director of Spiker. A couple of housekeeping points. Firstly, today's session is being recorded, and that recording and slide back will be made available to you following the webinar. For the panel discussion, please send your questions to the Q&A functions on Zoom and select all panelists when you're posting your questions. Spiker will provide written responses to any unanswered questions. We are happy for participants to also contact us directly for any clarifications and further information requests. We've done individual sessions with councils in the past, and we can also do that individually with any of you. Please provide Spiker with any feedback. It is important for us to improve our future webinars. Today's panel consists of some very experienced people that were involved in the Tasmanian water reforms. So today we'll be focusing on Tasmania, a state in the southern part of Australia. Mayor Jan Bond is not with us today. She was not going to be at today's session. However, she did talk at the previous session with the elected members, and you can see that in the recording of that session. Just in her background, Mayor Bond is currently the Mayor of Central Coast Council in Tasmania. She was also on the council during the reform process in Tasmania. She's Chief Representative of the Cradle Coast Authority in the north part of the state, and a former member of the General Management Committee for Local Government Association of Tasmania. The people that are here today on our panel are Andrew Wardlow. Andrew is a former General Manager of Councils in Tasmania. A GM in Tasmania is equivalent to a CEO in New Zealand. He was GM at Burnie, King Island, and West Coast Councils. He's also the former President of the Local Government Professionals Australia and a director of that same organisation. He sits on multiple boards, including Burnie Airport and Tas Communications. Paul West is also a former GM of councils. He was a GM at Devonport, Kingsborough, and Waratah Wynyard Councils in Tasmania. He was on the board and executive committee of Local Government Professionals and Local Government Managers Association, a national body. And he's also a former member of the Local Government Board of Tasmania. Jim Martin program managed the formation of Ben Lomond, one of the initial 3 regional utilities in Tasmania. We'll hear more about that during today's session. He's also he was also the managing director of Southern Water in Tasmania, which is in Hobart, and also chief executive officer of Northeast Water and Ovens Water in Victoria, and was also involved in the Victorian water reforms. Jim is currently Spiker's chief people and change officer. Just a couple of, I suppose, little rules of engagement for today's session. Our panel is cognizant of what's happening in New Zealand and the current state of your reforms. Go back, please. Thanks. Today's sessions are about the Australian reforms, in particular Tasmania, and the objective is to provide you with a reference point on which to draw comparisons to where you're at in New Zealand at the moment. We'll endeavour to provide you with unbiased views of what's happened in Tasmania in today's case. We are going to be focusing purely on the Tasmanian story, not what's happening in New Zealand, but I'm sure some of your questions might touch on that, and that's fine. Please align your questions to today's topics, and don't ask us any questions that are kind of directed at the IA, because they are not here today. Thank you. Bit of an overview and scene setting of the Tasmanian story and the Australian story also. Australia is a big country, and our water situation is complex and challenging. Continues to be challenging. We'll talk about the reforms, how they have delivered, what they have delivered, and how they have delivered them. I will start by giving you a high-level context of the current situation in Australia and Tasmania, and then we'll move more into detail on the reforms in Tasmania. The Tasmanian story is fairly recent compared to the Victorian ones, which we heard about the other day, and also a relatively straightforward one, nowhere near as complex or as convoluted as the Victorian reforms. Factors that helped Tasmania were the learnings from other states, in particular Victoria. And the integrated model of Tas Water was basically based on those learnings. Involvement of council peak bodies and councils was an important factor in the success of the Tasmanian reforms. However, while the approach was a little bit different and the drivers were the same as they have been throughout the country. Basically, the need to improve water quality, the need to have scale to raise capital and deliver major infrastructure projects and upgrades, and the need to have competition by comparison to drive improvement. We'll try our best to tell the story within the constraints of time that we have today, the context for New Zealand, and roughly where you're currently at with your decision making around these reforms. The current Australian water model. Australia consists of 8 states and territories, and roughly we have about 4 different water ownership and structural models. In Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, the Northern Territory, and the Australian Capital Territory, all the water utilities there are state government owned. In New South Wales and in Queensland, there is a mixture of state government ownership and local government ownership. Most of the local government ownership remains in regional parts of those 2 states, not within the cities. In Tasmania, we have a unique model there where we've got a statewide corporation that is owned by local government and state government. Next slide, please. So Tasmania, has water in this particular case. So Tasmania's got a population of 525,000, and there are 2 water utilities in Tasmania. The big one and the main one I'm going to be talking about today is Tas Water, that provides urban water and sewage services. We also have Tasmanian Irrigation, which provides irrigation water to the farming community. Tas Water is owned by all 29 councils in Tasmania, and also 10% of the shareholding is by the state government, and I think Paul will tell us more about that a little bit later. Tas Irrigation is state government owned. So the reforms briefly in Tasmania. Tasmania water industry had undergone significant structural and regulatory reforms since 2008. In 2009, on the 1st of July, the 29 council operated water businesses were merged yes, into 3 regional corporations: Ban Lomond Water in the northern part of the state, Cradle Mountain Water in the northwest, and Southern Water in southern Tasmania. The Water and Sewage Corporations Act of 2008 provided ownership of the corporation, provided that ownerships of the corporation remain with local governments based on their asset value and during the transfer. From the 1st of July 2009, the regional corporations commenced the delivery of water and sewage services. They also formed a common services corporation, a shared service corporation, that was owned by the 3 regional corporations that provided services such as HR, payroll, billing, etc. In 2013, the 3 corporations and the common service business were merged to form Tasmanian Tasmanian Water and Sewage Corporation, which is now called Tas Water, with the combined council ownership remaining. I will now hand it over to Paul, who will talk about the start of the reforms. Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and good morning, everybody. I'm going to go back over a little bit of the history that Mark just spoke about, but also give you a bit more detail as well. So in 1994, the Council of Australian Governments at an intergovernmental forum released a framework for water reform in Australia. Now, that was the start of the process, but it took about 10 years before we actually really got into it in a major way. So in 2004, the federal government decided to initiate the National Water Initiative, and that replaced the previous COAG framework. Now, that initiative, in 2005, the Tasmanian government became a signatory to that initiative. And it had about 70 key objectives in there. And the main ones were, as far as urban water was concerned, was to ensure healthy, safe and reliable water supplies. It was to increase water use efficiency in domestic commercial settings, encourage the reuse and recycling of wastewater, facilitate water trading between and within the urban and rural sectors, encourage innovation in water supply sourcing, treatment, storage and discharge, and achieve improved pricing for metropolitan water supplies. In 2006, the Tasmanian Premier, Paul Lennon, in his State of the State address, made the following comments. The future of Tasmania's water and sewerage is the most important infrastructure issue facing the state. Quality of water and sewerage services are vital to improving public health, environment and growth, and the government would be establishing a ministerial water and sewerage task force to deal with this issue. So in 2006, the task force was set up and a discussion paper was released in December 2006 and provided to councils who at that stage were the owners of the water and sewerage infrastructure and had total control of that infrastructure. So they got the discussion paper about a week before Christmas, and they had until the end of February to provide responses back to the ministerial task force. The priorities of the task force was to ensure that the water and sewerage sector operated in the future on an appropriate commercial basis and that it had the balance sheet capacity and the managerial and technical expertise to cope with the future challenges faced by the industry. And so it was very important as far as the government, as part of the task force was concerned, that those matters were taken into account in whatever the structure was that we were going to end up with at the other end of this process. Excuse me. Another driver for the reform was that the sector needed to have the capacity in the future to operate within a significantly enhanced framework to protect public health and the environment. And that there was a need to improve the economic outcomes for the state. Next slide, please, Craig. In 2007, the following events occurred. In responding to the discussion paper, many of the smaller councils expressed concern that they would not be financially viable if they lost the revenue that they were receiving from water and sewerage services. So in local government at the time, it was a common occurrence that councils would be siphoning off some of the water and sewerage income that they were receiving and actually using it to deliver other services within the community. There was also the aspect that the councils could legitimately charge administration and overheads to the water and sewerage charges, and because it was always a separate rate, so they were actually achieving income to also assist in providing those other services to their communities. The Local Government Association of Tasmania raised some concerns in 2007 that there was a lack of communication and engagement by state government with local government. At that stage, it was very much a state government process. The state government was directing what was going to happen, and certainly there was some media occurring at the time that indicated that local government would be losing its water and sewerage services. The state government would be taking it over, and it would basically, local government would have no say in it. So an issues paper was subsequently written and released by the Local Government Association. The President and CEO of Legat met with the Treasurer to voice their strong dissatisfaction with the process and to seek a better way forward. And local government sort of got itself organised around about this time and became quite vocal in its opposition to what was occurring. An implementation joint steering committee comprising of state government and local government representatives were formed as a part of the state government's process to try and appease some of the concerns that were being raised by local government at the time. And the president of Legat was appointed as the chair of that committee. And from then on, basically, local government became more of the driver of the reform process and had some control over what was happening compared to what had been going on previously. The agreement eventually reached between the state government and the 29 councils on the reform model, which was that the local government would retain ownership, was seen as an indication of the maturity of that relationship that had been built up between the states and the councils. In 2005, just going back a little bit, the Department of Primary Industries and Water had actually identified that there were 33 town water supplies and 58 wastewater treatment systems within Tasmania that required attention to meet contemporary standards. So that's a bit of an idea of why this became so important. And local government knew that they had these issues they had to deal with as well. So they wanted to be in partnership and make sure this moved forward in a coordinated way, but also that local government didn't lose total control. Next slide, please, Craig. So some of the key drivers for the reform, these are comments that were extracted from an address made to the Tasmanian Parliament by Treasurer Michael Aird in 2008. There was about $1 billion of new water and sewage infrastructure required in Tasmania over the next decade. And what I mentioned just a moment ago about the 33 town water supplies and the 58 wastewater treatment systems that were below par is part of that. Half of the 29 councils had not completed asset condition assessments, and 70% did not have adequate asset management plans. The financial returns from the sector averaged around 2 to 3%, which had resulted in little capacity to service debt, and an underinvestment was occurring in infrastructure. At the time, it had been calculated that a reasonable return on the investment for water and sewage would have been somewhere in the 7 to 10% mark. So councils were way under in that case. And in fact, some councils were making no financial returns at all from the water and sewage system. They were actually going the other way. Approximately 50% of the water treatment plants in Tasmania were not always in compliance with their licence conditions. That goes back to the 58 water treatment services were under par, and a lot of the treatment that was occurring was either primary or little treatment. There was some where it was just straight outfalls into the ocean. The water supply areas were on permanent, there was 23 of them that were on permanent water boil alerts, including key tourism areas. And that was a major issue for the state, that you were trying to become the tourism mecca for Tasmania, basically. And you would find that people would come here and then go to these tourist areas, particularly on the west coast and some on the east coast. And there would be a boil water alert. You'd turn the tap on and brown water would come out. And so that was an area that needed to be addressed to make it a much more attractive option for the tourism sector. Tasmania's water and sewage regulatory framework was light-handed compared to other states, and that was about the compliance, the EPA, and how that was being treated as well. Now I'll hand over to Jim, I think. Yes, Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Good morning, everybody. It's indeed my pleasure to be helping you with your decision making into the future, exciting future that New Zealand's certainly looking at the moment. My experience in Tasmania was twofold, effectively. As project manager of Ben Lomond, and I was asked to go over there just after I retired in Victoria. And as a consequence of that, I had a wonderful 12 months of helping the implementation group to get everything ready for the new water corporation. And then I was asked to come back again and fill in as CEO for a matter of about 6 months. So that was CEO of Southern Water in Hobart, which was a fantastic experience too. But this caption here effectively shows what happened in Tassie. And if you look across, I guess down the centre, it's all state government committees and the like. And I guess the nearest thing, and what you have to understand with this particular caption, is that this is what happened during the implementation. So you see on the right-hand side there, we've got the Implementation Joint Steering Committee. And on the left-hand side of the state government project team is the Operational Readiness Coordination Group. So they were two groups that basically, the one on the left derived all the information that was necessary to form a water corporation, and anything that that group couldn't do, it went across through the state government project team to the Implementation Joint Steering Committee. And you have that Joint Steering Committee already. and the decision making by that is purely statutory type stuff that the implementation groups couldn't deal with. And down below was also running in parallel was the local government regional governance structures, because with the changes, there was certainly a residual effect on the local government side of it as well. So they looked at all the issues as well. So it was pretty well organised, I thought. If we go to the next overhead, thanks. Yeah. So the Implementation Joint Steering Committee, as I think Paul said before, it really oversaw everything. It was represented by a lot of local government, as Paul indicated to you earlier, but also state government was involved, and it was Treasury over there that actually were the drivers on behalf of government. One of the big aspects of it was this conduit that I call it a conduit, simply the shareholders' letter of expectation. Now that was a very important conduit from council, from all the councils, 29 councils over there, to the water corporations, the three that were formed back in 2009. There was initial funding for these corporations to get up and running, and there was also funding for the 29 councils, because there was a lot of time spent during the transitional period, which, as I said earlier, was 12 months. So, and they had milestones in which they had to meet over there to basically receive the incentives that were paid. And you can see there was something like $5 million was provided to the local government sector to assist the transitional process. And as Paul said before, the president of LGAT, the Local Government Association of Tasmania, was comprised of those officials and representations across the state. So that's effectively how it all happened. You're not at that stage yet. You're still at your decision-making stage, and but once the implementation gets going, there's a hell of a lot of activity that occurs, and a lot of meetings. I was probably attending at least 4 to 5 meetings a month, and also doing a lot of communication. And that's the number one, communication. You can never do enough, unfortunately, but we do try. So thank you.
Andrew.
Thanks, Jim, and good morning to our New Zealand friends. I guess firstly, my journey in local government, associated with water and sewerage, was I became general manager on the West Coast, which was a mining community pre the reform, massive underinvestment in water and sewerage, and dealing with issues at a local level that was very difficult for a small rate base. From there, I went to King Island, a remote island, 1,500 people, and was there during the journey to the water reform. And in the latter years, I was at a city of Burnie with 20,000 population. So I've had a bit of experience across 2 relatively small councils, but 1 reasonably large council in Tasmania's context. Certainly not the larger with Launceston and Hobart. But I want to talk to you today really about where we were and where we got to in local government, and where we've finished up in the next series of slides. Paul talked about the task force. They were charged with the report in September 2006, and we found a report in local government in Christmas 2006, 3 months later, with a need for local government to respond, or for them to respond, for them to then provide a report to the Cabinet in March 2007, so 6 months from the announcement to when there was a fairly serious report going to State Cabinet. And our opportunity to comment on that basically was Christmas period, Christmas, January, a little bit into February. So very, very difficult to get local government organised in that time, which we managed to do. But the task force had obviously terms of reference, look at a high level review, look at the adequacy of the current systems of reticulated water and sewerage, and look at the scope of investment required to meet future needs in Tasmania. Obviously, examine structures of other jurisdictions and see what's the best structure for Tasmania. Look at the likely financial impacts on key stakeholders, and obviously local government was one. And Paul touched on that. All the different rating models with water and sewerage meant different things. There was a need in the future to have a transitional arrangement, so councils work off, so there was a transition of 3 years, so they could adjust their rating policies because there was evidence of overrating and underrating across Tasmania. Obviously, consultation was key, and local government got themselves fair and square in the middle of that. There's obviously other stakeholders that got involved in the process, and obviously the task of the task force was to prepare a statewide water and sewerage plan. Now, the state government, through that process, and I guess through a lot of talk of local government, considered 4 structural models, one being the state-owned entity, state-owned regional entity, and then local government, the both models as well. After the report, the Treasurer advocated that the state-owned single model with significant enhanced regulatory assistance would likely result in the best reform outcome for Tasmania. That was clearly their position and what they were advocating all the way through the process. Obviously, we've got a say in the report of what it would look like if local government was involved. And at that stage, local government's preferred model was the regional entity owned by local government, dividends retained by local government, not going to Treasury or central government, tax equivalents paid to local government, no detriment to employees was really critical. Employees would not be redundant on either side of the equation, and had a 12-month clause on that, sunset clause on that, so the employees, whether they stayed behind or whether they went, they were protected, and there should be no financial impact on councils. Thanks. Next slide. So out of that, in 2009, we set up the 3 models, 3 entities, which Mark touched on earlier: Coronal Mountain Water, Ben Lomond Water, and Southern Water. There was a common chair across those 3 entities and 3 common board members, and that was provided to give us consistency across the 3. And then each region also appointed three board members, so there was local representation as well as the statewide common board. So each board had 7 members. Then there was a common service provider corporation established to support those 3 regional corporations. And from memory, I think the CEOs were part of that board of that common service provider. There was ex officio committee established for initial board appointments, and later on the board appointments were done through the owner representatives group once they were established. And one thing is that in Tasmania we have GBEs, government business enterprises, for hydro, Tasports, a lot of government businesses, and this was treated the same way. So the Taswater does go to estimates, scrutiny committees with the parliamentarians once a year, and will get scrutinised and ask questions from all sides of government. Thanks, Craig. So while Taswater was created in 3 entities in the 4th corporation, it wasn't working very well. There was a need for efficiencies, and therefore it was determined through discussion with state and local government that it was time to actually merge into one entity, and all 4 become merged into what we now know as Taswater. Then later on, initially, obviously, there were 29 councils that owned it. The equity was distributed across a standardised asset base, so all the assets were valued on a standardised system, and those assets came across to the corporations back in 2009. Less liabilities, which was any loan debt associated with water and sewage infrastructure, and employee provisions that went across, and the net became the equity in the new entity, and that equity then ended up into Taswater. In 2018, the state government made another play for the water corporation, and were very, very strong in saying that this is not working. There's still more water notices on. There's still things, and we want to take it over and run it ourselves. And once again, local government found themselves in a robust discussion with state government. And out of all that, there was agreement that they would make a contribution of $200 million over 10 years, and local government conceded and gave them 10% equity in Taswater. That equity doesn't provide them with a dividend. It does provide them with an opportunity to be part of the owner reps, and also an opportunity to be on the selection committee for board members. The dividends being received by local government in recent times has been $20 million per year, distributed based on the equity that we talked about. In the last 2 years, that was halved to $10 million, mainly due to COVID and the revenue streams and supporting the community through the tough times of the last couple of years. But in the recent corporate plan, they're going to try and make up that $20 million over the next 5 years. So the distributions are forecast to be $24 million over the next 5 years. Taswater is an independent board, skills-based board appointed through the owner reps. And that I think is key to the success of the corporation. And it still has a maximum of 7 independent directors on the new entity. Thanks, Craig. I think I'll hand over back to you, Paul.
Yep, thanks, Andrew. So in 2017-18, the Auditor General in Tasmania actually did a performance audit. So he does about 2 of these a year, and he actually chose to undertake a review of the assessing the outcomes of the water and sewerage reforms. And the report was provided to the Tasmanian Parliament for review. The objective of that audit was to form conclusions on the extent to which the intended outcomes arising from the reforms of the water and sewerage industry had been achieved. The audit examined the performance of the entities, of the water and sewerage entities, and came to the following conclusions. So the summary of the findings are listed there, that they had primarily delivered improved public health benefits. Strategic asset management has improved with increased maturity. Service delivery and customer relations has improved. The reforms have largely delivered the expected financial benefits. The introduction of 2-part pricing has provided customers with an equitable pricing approach. The reforms have provided the regulated entities with increased revenue and cash flow. There was greater flexibility to deal with the capital expenditure programs, and they had better access to funding. So they had a larger balance sheet, so that allowed them to borrow additional funding. And there was strong benefit from the prices being set by the economic regulator rather than the prices being set by the 29 individual councils. And there was a lot of variations between the previous pricing arrangements that the council had put in place. The one area that he found that there still needed to be more work done on was in relation to the environmental benefits. I can say that since 2017-18, that has become quite a large focus of Taswater to actually improve the environmental benefits, particularly from sewage outfalls and the way that sewage is treated. Of all of the boil water notices that I mentioned very early on in this process, there are now no boil water notices at all in Tasmania. All potable water supplies have been brought up to appropriate standards. What didn't work well? I think you would be able to gauge that the 3 corporations were initially put forward. They didn't actually achieve exactly what was hoped, and that was part of the driver for why it became one corporation statewide about 4 years after the initial reform process. The common service provider for the shared services was ineffective. That was the common service provider brought all the back of house services into an area, so you would have common IT, HR, accounts payable, rating, and those sort of things would all be done through this one common service provider. It didn't work that well. They were challenged to start off with. Not only did they have 3 bosses effectively with the 3 regional corporations, but they were bringing 29 councils' information into the one. And so there was a lot of work that was required, and some of the emphasis that was required in that particular common service provider probably wasn't put enough emphasis put on it to start off with. And the varying price structure, I've mentioned that just previously as well. Each of the 3 regional corporations had their own unique way of looking at the setting of prices, so there was no consistency across the state either. So you've gone from 29 councils down to 3. The pricing of the 29 councils wasn't consistent. Then the pricing of the 3 regional corporations wasn't consistent. Now we have one consistent pricing regime across the whole state, and it makes it a lot easier for people to understand. Back to you, Mark.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Just a couple of points. We've touched on the board selection process and the negotiation between local government and state government to form Taswater. In the governance topic, which starts this afternoon, and I think for this group will be tomorrow morning, we will be hearing from Mayor Doug Chipman from Tasmania. And Mayor was involved in those negotiations to form Taswater. And also he is the head of the shareholders group council, and so he's involved with board selection, etc. So some of those questions he will go into more detail with Mayor Chipman today and tomorrow on those topics. First question is from Carol Nutt, and this has to do with stormwater. It's always an interesting question. Are the individual councils responsible for stormwater? She's just wondering why stormwater was included in the reform.
Yes, the councils have retained responsibility for stormwater in Tasmania. There was a lot of discussion about that at the time of the reforms, but it was found that the bulk of the stormwater was related to, well, a lot of it was related to the streets and the gutter, the curb and channeling and those sort of things, the drainage. So it was just determined that it was better placed to remain with the councils rather than being put into the Water and Sewerage Corporation. So their focus was purely water and sewage.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Just for everybody, I think, again, within Australia, we're rethinking that whole model at the moment. You know, where does stormwater sits, etc. I don't think we have an answer for it. I think it's actually good that you guys are considering including stormwater in the 3 water reforms, so you can look at it in a holistic manner within the context of what you're trying to do. It is part of the water cycle, and it's an important part of the water cycle. It's got to be managed properly. Paul, do you mind just touching a little bit on this Launceston situation with combined system? Because New Zealand might have some old combined systems too.
And that was what I was about to say, Mark, that there is still one system where there is a combined wastewater and stormwater, and that's in Launceston. And it was, I think it was developed in the sort of the late 1800s. And so it's a legacy matter that currently Taswater charges the Launceston City Council an amount of money to manage the stormwater for a part of the city, because it can't be separated from the sewage system. It does create some issues for Taswater, particularly in relation to in storm events, because there's a lot more water flow and those sort of things going through the system, and it does create some concerns for Taswater, and it's certainly an area that they are working on and will require quite a large amount of capital investment to actually address the problem in the longer term.
Great, thanks.
I guess also, Mark, in relation to stormwater, is that there is obviously a lot of infiltration of stormwater into the sewage system too, which becomes costly and those sort of things. There's been a lot of work done in that regard, especially by Taswater, whereas when it was with council, I guess it wasn't considered to be so important, but now it really is, because Taswater obviously want to treat the least amount of water they need to. I know in Burnie we had a big issue with the capacity of the plant for a major industry. And council was very fortunate to bid hard with that industry to get some funding, and spent, I think it was $3 to $4 million on doing a whole program across the municipality to actually get stormwater out of the illegal stormwater out of the storage, and that actually then lessened the amount of investment required to upgrade the plant so that they could put $140 million investment into a dairy factory. So they've got to still talk to each other, but it is pretty critical that stormwater is separated. But in Tasmania at the time, there was only Launceston and Queenstown on the west coast where there's a lot of rainfall that had dual systems, and Taswater quickly, I think, rectified the Queenstown issue. That was manageable, but Launceston was a lot bigger problem because it was so ancient.
Great, thanks. I'll pose a question to you, I think, Jim, and it has to do with the migration of employees from councils to Taswater. How did that work?
Yes, that was an interesting process. There was some 600 people that was transferred over from councils to the corporations. Tasmania did it with a bit of thought, more so than what Victoria did, because I thought it was a bit of a disaster in Victoria, but Tassie basically worked on a percentage because they had separated their accounts from the council function to the water and sewage functions. And they were able to recognise on a certain basis a percentage of work that was going into the water and sewage components. So people were actually between 40 and 40 and 60% had a choice of going across. Anybody above 60% participation in water and sewage went across, but there were still negotiations. Paul and I was having that discussion the other day. But what we did was I was able to bring over some former employees of North East Water, where I worked in Victoria. And we did we hired a minibus and we toured Tasmania, and we talked to every council and employee across Tasmania. And we were able to give them basically a picture of what a water corporation looks like, what its obligations are and how it can derive money. But more importantly, I got each individual from different parts of North East Water, which was about a $45 million revenue back then. That's in 2008. And each individual representing their own section, it might be IT, engineering, took a couple of operators across as well, both water and wastewater. And they were able to talk of their anxieties when they came across in Victoria from council to the water corporation. And I found that really, really important, because once they had presented, then we went off into separate rooms where the HR people and the operators met. And because what I found was people don't like to ask questions in a too public forum. And so when they're off in their rooms and I popped around to each one, there was a lot of discussion and a lot of relaxed feeling too. And I feel that's really, really important, because let's face it, we all know what it's like going into a new job ourselves. Doesn't matter what age you are, but when you're younger and with all this COVID influence of late in the last couple of years, I'm sure it's made us as human beings a little bit more vulnerable as well. And I found that worked really, really well in Tassie, and we were applauded in doing it. So it certainly went across really well, Mark.
If I can just add a little bit to that, Jim, and comment, please. Look, this process of reform and amalgamation is never easy, and it can be quite challenging for people, but it also creates opportunities, and I think that's, you can embrace those, and for this particular group listening today is potentially create some great opportunities for you.
Oh, that's a really important point. I never thought as a CEO of a water corporation that I'd be employing professors and doctors and scientists. You just don't think of the water industry in that respect. But these days, because of the technology, the amount of work that goes into efficiencies, all these people are essential and a part of of your staff. But just to give you an example of a fellow, and he's been over to New Zealand a couple of times with WIOG. WIOG is the Water Industry Operators Group, and it's a volunteer group over there, where WIOA is the Water Industry Operators Association of Australia. And it's a professional group, employs 6 people. I was chair of the board for 8 years. But what I found was a couple even on a couple of our directors. I remember he was employed in North East Water purely as an operator in a little town of about 700 people. Now he travels Australia looking at wastewater treatment. He's an expert in that area, great with kids, teaching them how it all happens. And he's been over to New Zealand, and now he travels quite often to Europe. So that's one example of he's an operator, an on-ground operator that is traveling the world using his expertise. So it just shows you the value of organising a specialised water industry. So there is a great lot of opportunity there for the future of future employees and a whole gambit of people too.
Great, thanks, Jim. If I can maybe put it back to Paul and Andrew, how did the council, so the remaining staff in council and all that deal, were opportunities created as a result of the reforms within remaining functions in council? Were they left a little bit lean or without expertise?
Yeah, I'll go first if you like, Paul, and you'll add from a bit of perspective than me. At the time I was on King Island, we had a very small community. We had 2 towns that had reticulated water and sewerage. There was probably only about 1 or 2 identified key people that work those systems, and the organisation administrative role was quite small. So I think we transitioned 1 of maybe 2 employees at the time, so very, very small scale, and there was nothing on the admin side. I arrived in Burnie about a month after the Water Corporation started in 1 July 2009. I arrived there in the August. In Burnie, it was a whole different situation where there was probably 18 employees or 20 employees went across. Clearly, the bulk of those were outdoor employees. But in Burnie's case, they took an opportunity because they realised, because of the size, that it would impact their administration side. So they also transferred over some admin type people that could do revenue and those sort of things, and work in other parts of the business. And that's pretty critical, is because most councils identify their water and sewerage employees are important to go across, but the corporations also got to set up administration base and people that have knowledge that can talk to customers and those sort of things. So it's important that those sort of people go across too. And obviously that's hard for small councils, but certainly some of the bigger councils would need to be considering. But Paul, you were Kingborough, I think, at the time, or Warwick, I'm not sure where you were, but you were in a bigger council at the time, so you might have a better experience of how you did that with employees.
Yeah, I was at Kingborough at the time. We had about 220.
Sorry, I was going to say, how big was Kingborough?
Yeah, about 220 employees at the time. Population is currently it's about 37,000 people. So it's one of the larger councils in Tasmania. It's about 4th or 5th. So it was a bit of a challenge, I suppose, from my recollection of it, particularly when we were deciding who was going to transfer and who wasn't, and justifying why certain positions would be transferred and why some wouldn't be. And so picking up on Jim's point before, if a person was doing more than 6% of the role, they would generally transfer over. But once 1 July came around and all these people had actually left the organisation, we then had this void of knowledge, I suppose, that had gone. So anything to do with water and sewerage, but also because in a council at that stage, people were covering numerous sort of roles, we did have a bit of a void, I suppose. But we'd put in place a process where we could have regular catch-ups with the staff, discuss what the issues were, and we also had an arrangement with the people at the new water authority if there was one of our employees that used to be at the council that we needed to get the advice from because they had the knowledge of a particular issue or whatever else, we always had access to them. So we could actually keep that communication channel going and make sure that people felt that they weren't just thrown on the scrap heap, I suppose, on either side. And it took a while for that to bed down, particularly at the time, Kingborough was growing very fast. And we had, I think I had 5 development engineers. Now 3 of them went over to the Water Authority, which then put the pressure for the actual DA processes back onto the other staff that were left there. And then we had to try and also make up for the difference in the income that we had as a result of the transfer of water sewerage. So I think the key thing for me was actually having regular discussions, communications with the people involved, and making sure that you could still feel the sort of still feel the love in the room, basically, and that people weren't just being left and said, "Well, this is a new day," because in some respects, I suppose it's a bit like a grieving process. People have left, people they'd sat next to for 10 years or worked closely with, and suddenly one day they're there, the next day they're gone. So it was about how we did that, and we had a big staff function on the last day to farewell the people and all those sort of things. So we just made sure we we kept that sort of process going.
Paul, if I could just add to that too, on the other side, in Tasmania, when I actually went back to Southern Water in Hobart, I went around the different groups just to see what the feel was like, you know, like there's what's left and then there's the new. And what I found with the group in Tassie, in Southern Water, was there was this, because they've been thrown together, there was a lot of intellect there, a lot of knowledge, but it's still, you're dealing with new people, and that takes a while. We human beings have this attitude of, you know, judging and testing, but it's time that actually brings them together. And I could see there was an inconfidence in the engineering group. And it's the engineering group, along with everybody else, because there's the hub of the wheel, but it's the engineering group that has a lot of pressure on them because of all these capital works that have to occur and occur quickly. And so I took them across to Victoria, and we did a tour of Victoria to look at different softwares that the capital group could utilise. And we're over there for about 4 days, and we came back, and on the Friday sat down and we did what we call the post-mortem of the trip. And it was amazing to see the confidence that had grown, because I heard comments like, well, we do as much as the Victorians do, and they've been doing it all these years. So that was really beneficial for that group to grow that confidence within. And I think from there, that was a catalyst for them to really spark and go forward confidently, you know. So it's funny, the two sides of the situation.
Yeah, Mark, just to finish off on that question, I think is something that triggered my mind is that because of all the working groups between local government and state government, and there was some agreement, I guess, that this was going to happen. So you've got to remember that the cabinet got the report in March 2008, and we were 50 months later, we had a new water and sewage system in Tasmania, which is not a lot of time. But over that 15 months, there was a lot of positive work happening between the working groups and getting ready for this and understanding what will go and those sort of things. But what wasn't able to happen was a revenue collection system in place by 1 July 2009. So because of the good relationships that have been delivered and some employees going, like I know in Burnie, for all the customers that are on our same software, we actually did the revenue for certainly the first 12 months, if not the first 2 years, and did all the revenue for about 12 of the councils, and other players did other parts if they had the thing. So the database didn't really go across for probably 12 months or 18 months or 2 years after, when they had the system in place, and then they took over the whole database. But that created some challenges in billing and those sort of things as all the things changed. But I guess, and the same thing's happening in engineering, that sort of stuff. The staff went, but there's a lot of collaboration between the two parties, because it wasn't hostile. It was a really, I guess, a lot of consultation, a lot of meetings and that sort of stuff. So when it hit 2009, I guess both sides tried to make it work as best they could.
Yeah, that's really important, Andrew, because I found that in Victoria and Tassie that the billing, you know, the revenue that you're reliant on is you really do need some good software because of all the differential ratings and the like. But it's the most important connection to your customers. It's your first connection as a water corporation too. So it's so important to have that up and running and well tested beforehand. Because I know in Victoria we were sending out bills for 1 and 2 cents, you know, and that didn't go down well. I can assure you of that.
I think billing is a good way to put off your customers. Getting billing wrong is a good way to put off.
So it was a challenge. It was a challenge in Tasmania, Mark. It's one that you need to put a lot of attention into.
Thank you. So perhaps related to that question from Gillian about training provided to staff prior to transfer. Are you aware of staff being prepared for transfer with training programs or anything like that? Or maybe, perhaps, if not before, maybe it's just after transfer to the corporations? If you're not aware of any, then yeah.
There was certainly lots of, and I think Jim has touched on it, there was lots of discussions with the staff and whatever else in relation to the fact that they were transferring. There was advance notice. We had to give them all advance notice that they would be transferring. We had to put in place an employee assistance program to ensure that if somebody was feeling, you know, they had concerns about the transfer, or what was going to happen, those sort of things, that they could talk to people as far as in those last few months, although they were still council employees, they were slowly transitioning, I suppose, into the Water Corporation, because more and more staff were required as they ramped up ready for 1 July 2009. They were starting to use the council staff to actually start to prepare for what was going to happen on 1 July. And so I'm sure that there would have been training from the Taswater, well, at that stage, the Three Corporations side as well, to actually get people on board and to know what they would be doing from that first day once it all clicked over.
Yeah, it's through the integration program itself too, whereby, you know, you have a committee representing different parts of the organisation. So you've got the HR people, the engineering, and representative of the operators and what have you. I found that as part of the integration, getting all the information together ready for the new corporation, that in itself was a good mental training session, because I know I was approached by a lot of people, you know, with a lot of questions, and I did some personal stuff as well to enable those people to understand where they're going. But I do believe that some professional training is necessary too. And if that's one thing we can learn, I'm sure that that would be an ideal way for, you know, our cousins to, you know, appreciate.
Yeah. Look, I think, Mark, one key for the audience today is do whatever you can to get prepared. Like in our case, we had 15 months from when the go button was hit, and certainly the last 3 months have become very intense, because under the framework, the minister had to sign off on the schedule. We transferred the assets, the employees, properties, had to identify what property was going, what was staying, and all that sort of stuff. That work is really immense back on the council side of it. So the sooner you understand what you've got to start doing and start organising your businesses to identify some of those things, because there was examples where land went that shouldn't have gone, and other places where land should have gone and didn't go too. So the more work you do in that space to understand what's important for your council, what makes sense for the water and sewage and those sort of things, that work is really, really important, because if you get that right, it's a lot easier than then having to do things and have discussions down the track if you don't get it quite right. Like some things are quite obvious with vehicles and those sort of things, but there was lots of issues in property and plant, in land, I guess, about where it should go. Like for argument's sake, in Wynyard, where Paul and I live, there was some land that got transferred over. The council really wanted for the development, but now they've got to try and negotiate it back because it went across in the deal, and it wasn't even needed. It was superfluous to Taswater, but they've inherited it because of the way the transfer was done.
Mm-hmm.
So you know what, do subdivisions and those sort of things, prepare what you want to go and what you want to keep. That's what I'm saying, I guess. The more you get prepared with those sort of things, the better you'll be, better state your council will be in at the point that something might happen.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a lot of expectation from the new corporation too, because they, you know, they're under pressure from government, you know, having to meet objectives and what have you. So the better tuned, I guess, is the word for the staff to be. It's better for the whole corporation as a whole. And I remember in Victoria, actually, we did have some professionals that came around for change management, and I thought that was really good. Even though Kenneth made a decision very quickly, prior to that, when I think back, we actually did have some preparation mentally, and with change expert change management consultants and the like. So that in a way prepared us. And then Kenneth just went snap, in 6 months you'll all be, you know, in this one corporation that we're delivering to you. So it was yeah, that was beneficial.
So if I can add a little bit too, I suppose Taswater and the staff at Taswater have had a significant capability uplift over the last few years, and it continues. There's always new skills, new ideas, new training required, etc. We'll be hearing from 2 current GMs the week after next of Taswater. David Hughes-Owen, who runs service delivery there, and Tony Wilmot, who runs their capital program. And Tony will watch this video and get a big head, but he's one of my heroes there, because Tony started life as a plumber in one of the small councils in Hobart, or one of the councils in Hobart. And over the years, he's risen, you know, he went into Southern Water and then Taswater. And over the years, he's risen to be GM of capital at Taswater. So he's now running a $200 million a year capital program. And to me, it's a great story, you know. And there's a lot like him. He's not the only one. There's a lot like him. Most of the regional managers came up through the ranks too, and I think there's some great stories, and that's about building capability in the organisation.
Yep.
So yeah, some excellent stories. So I've got another question here from Gillian, if I can ask it. It touches on, I suppose, what I've just been talking about, but has it been possible to determine whether the level of engagement amongst water staff have increased following the changes? I might handle that because I've probably done more work recently than you guys at Taswater. Just for the audience's information, our company's done a lot of work at Taswater. I've done a lot of work myself on the ground with them there. And look, I don't know what it was like 10 years ago, but it's certainly, when I look at Taswater today and today and having worked with a lot of the people there, there is a high level of engagement and ownership and pride in what they do. And it's a very well-run organization. It's, you know, and they recognize that they've got room to improve and take it forward, but they're certainly on that journey. But it is a very well-run, well-operated, engaged organization across all levels of the business. So, you know, I suppose I'm giving him a bit of a pitch, but I see that, and I've worked in other corporations that aren't quite as well as good from that perspective. Jim?
Yeah, one thing, I can't talk about Tassie's post because I was there as project manager and I was only there for 6 months afterwards, and we did do that tour. But at Northeast Water, I think because I was involved in 2 mergers within 3 years. In the first merger, it was 7 or 8, into one. That was called Ovens Water, and then 3 years later, Ovens and Northeast Water came together. So we'd built a culture at Ovens, but there was a totally different culture at Kiwa. So to get these 2 cultures together took me a hell of a long time. And we had to bring some professionals in to assist for that to happen, because people, you know, had already built something. And so I personally felt that the way to go about it too was to involve them in the strategy. So we actually did strategic planning from the bottom up and not the top down in this case, because I felt that it was really needed for the people to understand where we were going and how we were going. So we're able to, everybody was the spoke in the wheel. And I think that's an important ownership that's really important for people and your business going forward. It really is. So by working on that and reporting every, say, 6 months as to how we're going, your performance reporting, and getting those people together again, certainly gets them, makes them feel an ownership. And so as a consequence of that, I felt that actually helped us, you know, leap forward, whereas the first 18 months was a bit of a struggle because of the 2 clashing cultures. So I found that worked quite well.
Great, thanks. I might bring a question up that was actually raised at the previous session on this topic by the elected members. And I'll pose it back to you, Paul, because you touched on it a little bit. How is the process for transferring assets from council to water corporations handled? Yep. And mainly touch on the thing where you spoke a little bit about the piece of land in Wynyard, or maybe Andrew talked about it. And yeah.
Okay. The process was that there was an agreement that the assets would transfer over, and there was all assets were valued across the state. And so when they transferred over, there was a commonality in the values that was applied to the various assets. So that was to ensure that the councils got the correct level of equity in the new regional corporations. In relation to the point that Andrew made about the land, I can't talk about the Wynyard example that he mentioned, but I can tell you that when I was at Kingborough, the process that we followed there, we had a huge area of land associated with a treatment plant. Council had purchased a fairly significant piece of land, built a treatment plant on it. It was old and needed upgrading, but the community got used to this piece of land, and there was a buffer zone, so it was ensuring that you didn't have sewage within so many, such a distance from housing or whatever else. But what we did was we actually subdivided that land off so that we only transferred the piece of land required for the treatment plant and the upgrading of that treatment plant to the new water authority. And we kept the rest of the land, although it would never be able to be developed for housing. It is a very valuable piece of community park that is now, it has a, I think it's a dog exercise area, and it's got some outdoor gym type equipment on it, because the council was of the view that it didn't want to see that transferred to Taswater. An example is there was a reservoir in Devonport that was transferred to Cradle Mountain Water. At that stage, the reservoir actually was no longer in operation. So, but because it had a reservoir on it, it was transferred to the Water Corporation. In my time at Devonport more recently, the Taswater demolished the reservoir and sold the piece of land for a significant amount of money, because it was on top of a hill with a beautiful view of Bass Strait. And so therefore that was, I suppose that was jam for the Water Authority, because the council transferred it over at the value that was much less than what it was really worth.
And to give you a contrary to that, Paul, in Burnie, exactly the same scenario, council retained the reservoir and developed the land and sold it on. So they did it the other way, because they saw a better opportunity for the council. So they're the sort of key decisions that need to be made when what you put on your list that gets transferred in assets is what do you really need to keep, and what's valuable to the council.
You need to make the effort in the lead up to the reform, to the changeover, and really critically look at those sort of assets and say, are they critically water or sewage type assets? Should they be transferring? Is there a better way of doing it? Those sort of things. And there's a whole series of examples in the Tasmanian experience where either from a lack of resources or whatever, or thinking it might not happen, that at the last minute it won't happen, so we're not going to put too much effort into all this. There are so many examples of decisions that were made at the time that could have been a better decision for the community than what ended up being the case.
And there's been examples in Tasmania where some councils were probably thinking about this right back from September 2006 or even earlier in some cases. Other councils probably started thinking about it 6 months out, and all of a sudden they were probably weren't prepared to get ready. Yeah. The other thing is, I'm not sure in New Zealand, but obviously in Australia, in Tasmania, there's freehold title that councils own, but a lot of the water and sewage infrastructure is also on Crown land and is subject to licenses and leases. That's another area you need to look at if it's the same in New Zealand, because in some cases you might want to sign over the whole lease or license. You might only want to sign over part of it because the other piece of land is valuable to the council or the community that should be retained in the local council ownership.
Yeah, it's a very, very important prerequisite, because that just didn't happen in Victoria, so there was just tabletop negotiation of exactly what council used for water or sewerage that came across, even down to backhoes. We didn't even get backhoes. So it is a really important prerequisite, as I say, that you need to sit and evaluate, risk manage it, and strategically manage it as well. Very important.
Excellent, great, thanks. I'll just, in terms of some of the questions we've been getting, and I suppose the tone of today's conversation, one thing, what I think will add to our program, which will probably not be till November, is how the current corporations are building skills and capability in there, and what sort of programs are running and that sort of thing. So just look out for it. We'll schedule something for November, maybe bring in some of the GMs, HR, etc., and the water corporations, just to talk about what they're doing. It wasn't in the original program, but I think it's worth adding it to it, because I think it's an important element of I suppose, this discussion.
Like boot schemes and
No, and I'm talking about building capability within the corporation, like building skills, program development programs and all that, and what they're able to run as a corporation with scale and kind of a vertically integrated water business, so they can be a lot more focused. So I'll find some people that can talk to us about what they're currently doing at the moment. So this is a post-reform piece of information there. Okay, I don't think we have any more questions from the audience. So I think, Andrew, you touched on the timeline and stages of the Tasmanian reforms early in your piece, and you did say that it would probably been better just to have gone to the one corporation to begin with.
Look, I guess I think the question probably is, should have we done that right from the start? And I think the short answer to that is no. It wasn't successful. We should have just gone straight to the single entity. At the time, I was probably supportive of the regional models for a whole range of reasons. Hindsight did show pretty quickly that it wasn't the right way. Now, it was a shame in our case that we went through a major upheaval in 2009, and then we put some key stakeholders, whether they be customers or people in the organisation, through the same upheaval 3 or 4 years later. Ideally, that should have been a decision that was probably 10 to 20 years later, not 3 to 4 years later. But anyway, that's what happened. I think it happened for the right reasons. I think the one model now is the right thing. But even doing that, we're really conscious in setting up the regional entities with the common directors and those sort of things, get consistencies across the three corporations. And there was an effort made to standardise systems and processes through the common service provider, and that didn't work very well, that whole model. There was really a lot of work by the board to put in procedures and policies consistent across the thing, but that was a desired outcome, but it didn't work out. There was different geographical issues and those sort of things that people, like on the northwest coast, there was concessions for sporting groups. In the southern Tasmania, they were getting charged for water and sewage, that sort of stuff. So when it all came together, while it was harmonised, we had to go through the exercise again and then work with stakeholders again, because it wasn't exactly the same, because of, in the case of the directors, they had to act in the best interest of the corporation that they were serving the board on. So whilst three of them were on the board of the three entities, the other three, they're all in the one place. So what's best for this region as a whole, had to make those decisions. So it was I guess, more upheaval 3 years down the track that that answer could have all been sorted out in the first round in 2012. So in hindsight, I think we've also got to remember that the scale of Tasmania is a lot different to the scale of New Zealand. Population of Tasmania is 500,000 people. So it is quite small. So 500,000 people, I think, for one corporation is probably right. I don't suggest that New Zealand should go to one entity, and I really haven't looked at the makeup of all that. I think there probably will be need, because of scale and that sort of stuff, that we need to be. I think it's 4 at the moment they're looking at, which is probably right. But what I say is, I think in hindsight we should have gone to one right up front. But I would have been an advocate for the regional model. I would have been on the local government bandwagon at the time, but it wasn't the right way to go.
Can I have a contrary view to that?
Yeah.
Because I have the view that I think that the regional process to get local government across the line in the first place was the advantage. I don't know if it happens in New Zealand, but even in Tasmania, there's a north-south divide. The people in Hobart, in the south of the state, have a real issue about the north of the state and vice versa. And so I think if the government had tried to really push a single authority, water authority across the whole state, the noise from local government would have been so much louder than it was. I think the fact that there was some compromise and it was allowed and agreed that we would have 3 regional corporations got it across the line. But picking up on Andrew's point, 3 years later, the councils could actually see what the benefits of this had been, even so there were some issues in the regional model, so much so that when there was discussion with the owner reps about going to a single entity, there was hardly a squirmer. It happened from local government's perspective, it happened reasonably seamlessly.
Yeah, it's
It just made sense,
say
I
that,
guess.
Paul.
So I'll
when-
jump in. Sorry, guys, because we've got a new question from Julian. And this is a good one. This again comes back to people and attracting people to the corporations, etc. So her question is, what are the various corporations doing to attract people and to retain staff? The challenge New Zealand is facing is that they're probably going to need somewhere between 5,000 and 9,000 people joining the sector over the next 10 years or so. Yet they currently have a 10% vacancy. So do we have a view on this as to, what are we currently doing and what can you do to attract and retain staff?
Well, I might go first there if I can. At North East Water, we had absolutely no trouble in attracting staff because it's the industry that is the attraction, and it's the whole gambit of a water corporation these days. The type of activity in becoming precise. You're dealing with an economic regulator, so you need analysts to really define your figures. You've got to prove your figures that they're 100% right, and that's a lot of work. So the Water Corporation, in my experience, has certainly attracted, as I said earlier, a whole gambit of type of talent. And because of the work that you have to do, the GDP input of a water corporation, and I think you had a study done in New Zealand of that by Deloitte, how much that inputs into the country. So you have a multiplier effect too. But back to the corporation, you've got to have people, even with boot schemes, that are running parallel to your engineering team. So you've got to have a manager to manage that. So you're advertising all the time for these type of people.
Sorry, Jim, just remind everyone what the boot scheme is.
Oh, sorry. The boot scheme is build, own, operate, transfer. So that money is provided by the company that applies for this approach. So you don't even have to have it on your books of account. You just pay a lease or a monthly fee for this to happen, and they design, build, operate, and transfer it back at a certain time. So that the build is done not with plastic parts. It's done very well because they have to operate it. So it's really important, and it's a quality way of actually getting building or treatment plants, wastewater plants built. And there's quite a number. There's alliances as well. There's just booze. You don't even have to transfer it back. So there's a combination of procurement that is very worthwhile to use and to keep the momentum of meeting the government objectives of clean water and wastewater treatment.
Mark, on that other issue about attracting staff as well, I think it's important to note that if you've got a big entity that has got a really strong brand, attracting people to that will be a much, I suppose it's a bit more sexy, I suppose, than working for a smaller
Absolutely.
water authority, council, whatever, where the I think the investment that is put into these areas make it so that it's much more attractive. It's got a lot more scale and scope for people to advance with their career and those sort of things in a big organisation than potentially in the smaller sort of small town type water and sewage infrastructure services that needs improving and those sort of things.
If I can.
That's a good point. Sorry, Mark, a really good point, because with what I found is with younger careers, they like that the turnover of younger careers is around about 5 years, and they get a lot of experience in those 5 years out of a water corporation because of its expertise. And as a consequence of that, I always was conscious of I'll only have this great brain for 5 years, so I've got to utilise it to the best. But what they look at too is the type of industry, and the brand is right, Paul, is that when you consider that what we are doing, we're elevating human standards by water quality, we're lifting standards across the state or the country, but also alternatively to that, you're an environmentalist expert too, because you know you're cleaning up the environment with wastewater treatment and reuse aspects of your business. You don't waste water. So I think a lot of people love that as a brand, that you know they're doing something for the country and themselves. So I think it's an important brand and an easy brand to sell.
Thanks, Jim. If I can add, sorry, something, it's not just about people, it's about skills and developing skills.
Yep.
And one of the things I think we lost the ball on in Australia going back, 10, 20 years is apprenticeship programs and things like that. We let that slip. We didn't invest in it. We're actually trying to catch up now.
Yes, yeah.
So I think, for the audience, you need to start looking at that. You need to start looking at what programs you're going to put in place as the corporations are formed to develop homegrown skills, having a good apprenticeship program, grad certifications and things like that, and engineering graduates and cadetships. And I do believe the utilities and government organizations have a responsibility to invest in these sorts of programs, and particularly build a skill base for the country at large. And I think you've got a great opportunity to do so, and start looking at that now if I were you. You're going to need a lot of apprentices to build the infrastructure, a lot of tradesmen, to build, or tradespeople to build the infrastructure you need going forward. And you've got to start training those people now.
Oh yeah, local tradespeople get a lot of work out of all this. There's not a problem, because when you're working remotely and the board looks at work not just around the major cities, it looks right, its whole region. It takes into account the employment, and as I say, the GDP is upped simply because of the amount of work that has to happen, and a lot of smaller people, trade people, all types of businesses benefit by this reform happening.
Jim, I think in saying that though, I think that's been a little bit of an issue in Tasmania as all corporations got bigger. That local plumber that was going to do a bit of work at the treatment plant no longer qualified because he didn't have the right things in place and those sort of things. So it's really important that you take all your current suppliers on the journey with you, because a big corporation, especially with some of the smaller councils, can get left behind. So you really got to nurture your whole procurement base and make sure that transitions to the new business, because otherwise that's where the noise will come at the local members too. Yeah. When that tradesman that was getting over $10,000 work a year, just doing a bit of work at the treatment plant, all of a sudden the opportunity is gone, he'll get aggrieved, and that noise will come back through the local council. So you need to sort of make sure you do a bit of work on the journey with all your suppliers.
Yeah,
I do know Taswater's doing a lot of work like that with the electricians, because most of the electrical work is actually done by contractors for them, and they are doing a lot of skills development work and capability uplifts around different parts of the states.
Yeah, it's the consciousness, I think, Andrew, that the managers have to have too, but that consciousness is determined from the board, CEO level as well. That comes down.
In Tasmania, a good example of what happened in Tasmania for the people, for the staff, was that the chairman of the board was, name escapes me, Jim, the ex-Hydro CEO.
Oh, yeah, Jeff Willis.
Jeff Willis. And he came in, and Hydro had a very, very safety conscious, as you do, it had to have electricity. And I guess the safety conscious of the employees going across from some of the council wasn't there. And their uplifting, in the first lot of work they did was upgrade all the plants with safety. Spent a lot of money in the first 12 months just doing that, and they had a real safety culture. And that permeates through to obviously your contractors and that too. But that was a really, really big thing up front, and it comes with big corporations, and that's a journey you've got to educate your employees on, because they're going to go into a different environment, different culture. In the case of Tasmania, both for the regional and the statewide, the managers essentially, the senior managers were all new. I don't think, the only one example I can think of was I went to Burnie as a director of corporate services. The previous director did get one of the jobs in the common service providers. He was a senior manager in Taswater, but in the common service provider for the thing. I don't recall too many other senior managers going across. And that's because all the senior managers, water and sewer was only part of their jobs. They were looking after roads and sewerage or something like that. So none of them really transferred across, apart from what was in the there was 3 regional entities already looking after mainly bulk water. So some of those employees went across at a high level, but most of them weren't the senior managers in local government that went across.
Okay, great.
And this is
Thanks.
important too.
Sorry, Jim, we need to wrap it up.
Oh, God.
We've got 3 minutes left. So just one thing, there's a couple of outstanding questions around public engagement and oppositions from councils, and we'll return to those, I think, in the governance sessions, guys. So we'll touch on those later today and tomorrow in those sessions. I just might ask all of you just to, a minute, just to any concluding comments, please. Jim, you go first.
Oh, okay. Well, I'd say that the future is really beneficial for all concerned, for employees, for the country, and for the best part of the country, the environment. And I think if you look at those 3 elements, it's a success story, and it's done professionally well. So best of luck in your decision making, folks.
Thanks, Jim. Paul?
I'd just say be prepared and get the information that you need and get your ducks lined up, because you need to be ensuring that you get the best outcome for your community in any transfer that actually happens. So, and don't be scared of it. I think from my perspective as both somebody who was in council, but also as a consumer, I'm more than happy with what has transpired with the transfer from water and sewerage from councils to Taswater in Tasmania.
Great, thanks. I think that's really valuable advice, Paul. It's be prepared, look at your assets, only transfer what you need to, keep whatever else can add value to you in the future within council. Andrew.
Yeah, look. I think there is a point where you've got to advocate and there's a fight, but there's a point where you've got to be realistic and then the things are going to happen. Look, I guess at the end of the day, the earlier you realise where that point is and engage the process is going to go forward, the better off your council will be going forward. So really, yes, there's a lot of discussion going on in New Zealand at the moment to get the best outcome for local government, but there is a point where you've got to really start thinking, this is going to happen. How do we get ourselves best prepared to get the best outcome for your community? And like Paul, being a practitioner of local government in Tasmania, we weren't equipped to look after water and sewerage, particularly the medium and smaller councils. And it's probably we're in a far better state in Tasmania because of the reform and having Taswater look after all water and sewerage.
Great, thanks. Thank you. Thanks to the panel. Thanks to the audience. Thank you for joining us today. I ask you all for feedback, please. Topics you want us to cover in the future, ways you think we can improve these sessions. Have a great day, everybody. Stay safe. Thank you.